Good morning, everybody. Welcome. We're delighted to have you here. Lovely morning, but it's better to be inside right now because we've got two remarkable leaders that are going to share with us their insights, and we're delighted that we're able to have them. When we have public events, and before we start, we always start with a little safety announcement. So in case you hear an announcement that we need to evacuate, please follow Heather. She's going to be responsible for you. We're going to take the stairs right back through that door, down 2 flights, take one flight, take 2 left turns, and a right turn will go over to National Geographic. They have a fabulous show on right now about the Titanic. You know, it turns out the Titanic, discovering the Titanic, was a cover story for our operation to try to learn more about why we lost the Scorpion. It's a fascinating story. You should go over and see the show. We'll pay for the tickets if anybody need to do that. We're delighted to have Senator Tillis, Senator Shaheen with us today. They are leaders because they championed the creation of the Senate NATO Observers Group. This was something that they had done in consultation with Ambassador Senator Kay Bailey Hutchison, who is our ambassador to NATO. And the three of them realized that the foundation of NATO is a political commitment to the security of Europe. And the United States is tied to that. And it's far better for us to have allies in the world, and that we needed to reinforce that by the Congress and the Senate coming back into the game to be observers and to be actively engaged with NATO. These two senators are the leaders that made that possible. We're going to listen to them today. Couldn't be more timely. Heather, you're going to start this program, and let's get going, because we have a very hard stop for the senators. And so it'll be 45 minutes. We'll get going. Thank you.
A week ago, yesterday, I was waking up to a headline that said, U.S. contemplates withdrawal from NATO. Now, that is a way to jolt yourself out of bed in the morning. And so we were so grateful. Originally, we were planning this conversation before the NATO Summit, and then both of you were called to be part of that delegation. So I'd love your impressions of a week ago, your sense of the NATO Summit, and then what is the Senate NATO Observer Group going to be doing? Help us know what your plans are, hearings, what is the rich agenda you have for this important group. So Senator Shaheen, may I start with you and then ask Senator Tillis to jump in?
Well, the Senate NATO Observer Group actually began back in the late 90s when NATO was looking at enlargement, and it was an effort by Trent Lott and Tom Daschle to say we're going to have a number of accession agreements that we need to shepherd through the Senate, and this is a way for us to better engage the Senate and help make sure this gets done. So as we look at the some of the equivocation about the importance of NATO by the president, as we look at the current challenges we face from Russia, from cyber, the continued challenge from terrorism, Tom and I thought that this would be a good time to think about reestablishing the Senate NATO Observer Group as a way to both help us focus on some of those challenges that we face, and also as we look at other potential countries joining NATO. They just signed an agreement for Northern Macedonia, now that they have agreed to this new name, or are on the way to agreeing to a new name, to join NATO, and that will need to go through the Senate. And for those of you who remember Montenegro, it took a very long time for us to get the Montenegro Treaty through the Senate. So thinking about all of the challenges that we face, we thought this was a very important time to reestablish this group, to think about how the Senate could reaffirm the importance of NATO to the United States, to our national security. And we arrived last Thursday in Brussels and what greeted us as we came in the door was the president's going to pull us out of NATO. And so we had a very good conversation with an audience talking about the commitment that we have in Congress. The Senate just passed a resolution 97-2 reaffirming the support for NATO. The Foreign Relations Committee passed a resolution 20-1 that hasn't yet gone through the Senate, but again, reaffirming the importance of NATO. So I think it's very important for us now to remind Americans, to remind our colleagues in Congress how important NATO has been to post-World War II security in the West and in the world. For the last 70 years, much of the stability we have enjoyed has been because of a lot of international institutions, but NATO has been critical to that. And as I think about the importance, it's not just been to our national security, but it's also been to democratic values, because one of the things that NATO does is reinforce the importance of democratic institutions in the countries that are members. And so it's a way for us not just to have allies in protecting our security, as we saw post 9/11, when that was the only time NATO has invoked Article 5, but it's also a way for us to continue to support the shared values that we have for democracy, for freedom, the importance of all individuals. So I think I'm excited about this effort. I'm even more excited after our experience in Brussels and the need to reaffirm why NATO is important.
Senator Tillis.
Yeah, well, you were waking up to that headline. We were miking up to go on stage to discuss the subject of U.S. Congress's commitment to NATO. I mean, literally real time. The phones were blowing up. And I think that it was important for us to convey the message that Congress understands that NATO is a very, very important part of securing freedom across the world, in the United States and in Europe. And the Senate NATO Observer Group is also important because I believe that we're going to see other countries want to come in, Macedonia being probably one over the next year. So Senator Shaheen and I had an opportunity to meet with the leaders of Macedonia. And interestingly, in that discussion, they were talking about how Russia doesn't even hide their efforts anymore. They're wide open in these countries through hybrid warfare, through any number of tactics, trying to destabilize these countries and ultimately sway public opinion and make them take steps further away from the West. This is not a time where you retreat from any nation of any size who is living up to the very strict requirements to be a NATO member. This is the time to bring more into the family of nations. So I thought it was important for us to go over there and talk about it. I think also that the Senate NATO Observer Group can play a number of different roles. Another area that we need to reinvigorate, and the president of the EU Assembly was the third panelist in Brussels, and I met with him in my office. He happened to be planning on coming to the United States. I met with him in my office. I think we also have to increase U.S. engagement, the House and Senate, in the EU Assembly. I think their next major meeting's in Halifax. I, for one, think that we should be there and be present and show that the voice of the American people doesn't come through just one branch. It comes through two branches, and the U.S. Congress is a very important part of that. And then finally, I'll just tell you that I've yet to meet any man or woman with stars on their shoulders who think exiting NATO is a good idea. General Mattis famously said the only thing worse than going to war with allies is going to war without allies. The NATO alliance is critically important, and we have to make sure that we do our role in communicating the importance of it and the commitment to it for the NATO partners.
No, absolutely. I will just say, when the Senate NATO Observer Group was formed between 1997 and 2007 on that NATO enlargement, it was bipartisan. It was an engine to grow support for the American people, to understand why we are enlarging to include such countries as Montenegro. I want to talk a little bit about the President's interview about Montenegro in just a minute, but before we leave that, I'd like to drill down a little bit, because Senator Tillis, it was something that you had, I believe, tweeted out. You said, the NATO alliance has widespread support among members of the U.S. Congress, and any attempt to leave this important organization would not be final until Congress has spoken. Mm-hmm. So I want to drill down a little bit on that, because we know the Senate is critical to providing the advice and consent when NATO amends its treaty, usually to include a new member. But there is no role formally, constitutionally. You don't advise and consent on the way out. And I think we really crossed a major threshold last week at this time to even contemplate that. What can Congress do to, it maybe not prevent, but at least slow down or provide that rich need for Congress to have its say on something of that monumentous of a decision?
Yeah, well, first, Make no mistake about it, I do not believe that the president has any intention of withdrawing from NATO. I do believe that the president uses various devices to capture people's attention, and incidentally, using those sorts of devices has gotten the NATO members on the right track for contributing and getting their investment in NATO up to a level that I think is important for the success of the alliance. What I was referring to is we have any number of options provided that we get the votes. And I think there would be nothing more unifying than any president, whether it's President Trump or, pick one of the 20 people that plan on running in 2020, if they were to actually seriously withdraw from NATO. I think it would create a unifying event unlike anything you've seen in U.S. history in terms of actions that we can take. So it's not just resolutions of disapproval or some sort of sense of the Senate at a 60-vote threshold. I honestly believe that with the same 97-2 vote would be the kind of vote that we would have for congressional action for any number of things that we can do. And I'm not going to get into specifics because then the press will play that up and speculate on what that would be. Again, I don't believe that the president intends to withdraw from NATO. I think it's the way that he tries to negotiate, but in this particular case, I think it's important for us to say that's not the path you should go down. You should absolutely require the NATO members to pay their fair share to make sure that they're ready, capable, and researching the appropriate weapons and tactics to defend their own homelands. But once you go beyond applying pressure to do that and use the device of withdrawing from NATO, I just don't think that it's I don't think that it's credible, and again, I think it's a unifying event. You would have people across the political spectrum come together and have Congress speak. And we'll figure out what that means, but I think it's purely a hypothetical. I don't think it happens, which is a very important message that we need to get out there. Everybody wants to play up on the imminent withdrawal of NATO. I don't think that's in the cards. But I don't even like the fact that it's become a possibility that we have to shift our attention away from getting the economic agreements with our EU partners in place. The alliance has to be at a military and economic level. We need to be focusing on productive dialogue to settle that so that we can then go after Russia, which is an adversary, can't be trusted, first among them Vladimir Putin, and China, which is trading unfairly, has a 30-year strategy for supremacy, both economically and militarily. Those are the sorts of things we need to bring the alliance together so that we can make ground on.
Senator Shaheen, it's absolutely true. Secretary Mattis, in both the national security strategy and the national defense strategy, allies are our center of gravity and strengthening that. How, as through the Senate NATO Observer Group or even through the SASC, you're also on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the allies are bruised between tariffs. We have European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker coming here next week. It's unclear whether there'll be more tariffs placed. How do we get back to that original strategy of allies are our strength, not our foes, as the president suggested that the EU is a foe?
Well, I'm not sure we can control what the president does, but I think reminding us and reminding the American public about the importance of allies is really critical. You know, I was in Warsaw the week that we put American troops back into Poland back in 2015. And I can tell you, or 2016, whatever, I can tell you how everyone that we ran into in the country was so excited to have America back in Poland because they knew that that meant that we would not let Russia go into Poland in the way it went into Georgia, the way it went into Ukraine. And that kind of appreciation and really relying on America's support as an ally is critical to this relationship. And you know, one of the things that struck me in Brussels, where at the end of the day, the people we talked to about the meetings and the president's comments said, well, it turned out okay. I went from there to England for another event, and he was there meeting with the prime minister, and the news reports were that, you know, after the the article that appeared after the meeting, after the insults, well, it turned out okay. I think there are only so many times that that can happen, and it begins to chip away at the belief that the United States is a reliable ally that can be counted on. And that's the problem that I think we're facing. It's not, I agree with Thom totally. I don't think we're going to pull out of NATO. I don't think Congress would allow that to happen. I don't think the American public would allow that to happen. But the more there are these instances where people are not sure what the reaction of the United States is going to be, and make no mistake, it's important for all of us to have a voice and to talk about our commitments, for Thom and I and for the Senate NATO Observer Group to talk about the importance of NATO. But what the President says does have resonance. And we need to do everything we can to reassure our allies that we are a reliable partner, but understand that it's taking a toll. And the longer these kinds of incidents go on, the Helsinki press conference, the more Europe decides, well, maybe we're going to go our own way. And I think that's a challenge for us as we look at our foreign policy in the future. And understanding that, as we know, our foreign policy is not just based on our military might, it's based on our economic, our soft power, and trade, and looking at how we rely on each other through trade is another piece of that. And so the tariffs are another thing that has raised concerns among our allies about whether we're a reliable partner.
So again, absolutely on that theme, I think after the NATO summit, you had a very strong NATO declaration.
Right.
And absolutely right, it came out as a solid, but we weren't talking about the strong statement. We were talking about everything that we've just talked about this morning. And I think earlier we felt that President Trump had resolved the question about the U.S. commitment to Article 5, the security commitment. And then I think that was thrown back into question again on his interview that was taped in Helsinki, but it just was released Tuesday night, with the interviewer questioning why would an American son or daughter be sent to fight for Montenegro. And the president had suggested that he also questioned that and whether Montenegro would be aggressive and could potentially create a World War III. And I just want to read you a tweet from Latvian Foreign Minister Rinkevich yesterday. He said, "For the record, Latvia joined NATO not because we are aggressive, but because we feared aggression based on our own historic experience, and we share common Western values like democracy, rule of law, and human rights. No intent to start World War III." So how do you help, as we think about welcoming the Republic of North Macedonia as they enter that? That's going to become before the Senate. So that's ratifying the NATO treaty or amending it. What do you say to your constituents, Senator Tillis, if that interviewer asked you that question?
I would say that we have an obligation under the treaty to do exactly what nations did after 9/11, period, end of story. There are some 1,044 men or women from NATO countries who have died in the war on terror. The war on terror occurred when an attack on U.S. soil occurred. That's all you need to talk about when you talk about our commitment to Article 5. These nations that are on the front line, to suggest that they would want to instigate a war would mean that they would want to instigate their own suicide. They're literally on the front lines. Some of these nations by themselves would be occupied within a matter of hours. To think that they would want to provocate that sort of conflict is beyond my, and look, I've only been in the Senate for 3.5 years, so maybe I just don't have the intellectual base or the knowledge base to draw on it. But it would make no sense to me that a nation of that size would be the nation that started the spark that would start that kind of war. To me, it makes no sense. But again, I've only been here 3.5 years. Maybe there's a higher level of logic there that I can't quite get.
Senator, and you mentioned Poland. Radek Sikorski, the former Polish foreign minister, defense minister, wrote a very powerful op-ed, which was released in the Washington Post, saying he was shaken. I think Poland sent forces into Afghanistan, into Iraq, not because they feared the threat from Afghanistan for Iraq, because they were in solidarity with us. They did sacrifice. It's a shared sacrifice. It's not a one-way street. How do you, again, for me, this is about educating the American people, because we can say here and go, this is really good, but if the American people don't believe it's very good, how do you send that message? How does the Senate NATO Observer Group get that message out exactly to what Senator Tillis said?
Well, for one, I think we remind people of what happened after 9/11. Most of my constituents remember those days very well, and the threat to the United States and how we felt about it. And so when you say to them, well, remember the only time Article 5 was invoked was for the United States after 9/11, that does help make the case. But I think it's also reminding people that the threats that we face have not gone away. If anything, they've increased with cyber intrusions, with terrorism, which continues to be a challenge, the threat from Russia, which not only is facing Europe, but it's in the United States. I mean, we heard from Dan Coates last week that they are already planning to influence our 2018 election. They're already here. They're doing mischief on the ground now. As he said, the lights are blinking red. I read some of the classified documents yesterday about what Russia is doing. I think we need to make some of that available to the American people so people understand what the potential threat is. And the more allies we have, the more we are able to counter those threats. And again, it's not just about the military piece. As you point out, or I guess the
Minister Kevich,
yes, of Latvia said, it's also about the shared values that we have for democracy, for human rights, for the rule of law. Those are all also part of what NATO does. So, part of the reason for the Senate NATO Observer Group was to talk about that role that NATO plays and the importance of that, not just among our colleagues, but for the country. And we have just this week, Senator Schumer and McConnell announced 10 more members, 5 each Republican and 5 Democrat. We also have 10 ex officio members. So among us, we have over a fifth of the Senate who are part of this effort. So we have, I think, a good base in which to begin to get out and talk to people about why NATO is so important.
If I may turn to one specific NATO member that I know both of you have been very involved with and in conversation with, and that is Turkey. And speaking of the community of values and the defense of democracy is really NATO's essential mission. You, Senator Shaheen, recently visited Turkey and met with President Erdogan. And Senator Tillis, you have a constituent, Father Brunson, who has been in jail for 2 years. We just learned yesterday will remain in jail during his trial. I would like you both to reflect on Turkey as a NATO ally, an important ally, geostrategically located, a big contributor to NATO, but yet we see this ally, I would argue some other allies as well, are struggling in their own development democratically. So Senator Tillis, may I start with you and ask for your reflections and then turn to you, Senator Shaheen.
First, Turkey is in a very complex part of the world. And on the one hand, I can understand the challenges that the President Erdogan has working with his own internal conflicts and working with the external conflicts that are right on his border, including what I do believe are terrorist organizations trying to destabilize his country and his regime. But there are certain requirements that nations must fulfill to become a part of NATO. And those requirements don't end after you're a member of NATO. So there's one side of me that wonders, as I was thinking about Macedonia and thinking about the boxes they have to check to actually ultimately come into NATO, I wonder whether or not Turkey could actually pass that test based on where they are today. It's a very different Turkey than the Turkey I visited when I was Speaker of the House, led a delegation there, spent about 10 days in country, and we built great relationships with the mayor of Kayseri. Actually had he in a delegation. He's now a minister in Turkey. to build economic ties, build great relationship. They were really moving in the right direction, secular nation, more democratic reforms, recognizing Christian religions, discussion about reparations for some of the takings during the revolution. That's a very different Turkey than it is today. Now it's a Turkey that's imprisoned Presbyterian minister that by the time he goes to his next hearing will have been in prison for 2 years, 19 months without any charges. And the charges are, I honestly believe, a first-year law student would review the indictments, review the hearing that I went to. I was in a Turkish courtroom for 12 hours about a month and a half ago. You wouldn't be in jail. I don't even know if they'd take your lineup picture if they took a look at the charges that have been levied against him, and yet he's been in prison, will be in prison for 2 years. We have a NASA scientist that's already served 2.5-year term, mainly guilty of visiting his family at the wrong time in Turkey. We have a number of people with that work with the embassy, DEA agent, a number of other people who have been in prison. So the message that we're trying to send to President Erdogan is you are an important ally. You came into the NATO alliance in 1952. They're a very important strategic partner, but when you start talking about acquiring a missile defense system from Russia that literally could not be hooked up to the radar system that operates with NATO because of the threat that would represent, when you talk about taking the most sophisticated tactical fighter that's ever flown in the air and have it a part of your Air Force, then we've got to have a serious discussion about where Turkey is going and whether or not they really are behaving up to the standards that a country must exhibit to be a member of NATO.
Senator Shaheen?
Well, a little over 2 weeks ago, Senator Lindsey Graham and I visited Turkey. We had a chance to meet with President Erdogan. We also visited Pastor Brunson. And we made that case that our allies don't imprison falsely American citizens. And we agree that the relationship between Turkey and the United States is a very important one. We have people stationed there. We fly out of Incirlik Air Base, and we appreciate that. But as a NATO ally, we also expect different behavior. And I have to say, I had never met President Erdogan before. Senator Graham had. He thought it was a very good meeting, and I thought he listened to the concerns that we raised. We made the point that Senator Tillis has just made, that it's inconsistent with NATO to have them buy a missile system from from Russia. I've begun to think about them as the Soviet Union again.
We slip from time to time,
I know.
too.
But that's inconsistent with NATO and with the systems that we have in NATO that we expect all of the NATO allies to comply with, and the technology that we are providing with the F-35, and Turkey has been part of that program. They've been one of the countries that has bought in from the beginning. That's just inconsistent. We think there are ways to get around those issues that can both address our concerns and address Turkey's concerns, and we need to continue to work on those. But one of the challenges I think that we have had is that we've sort of, in the United States, sent mixed messages about what we think is acceptable and what's not acceptable. One of the efforts that Senator Tillis and I have worked on is trying to get language into the defense authorization bill around the F-35 and slow down that acquisition so that they understand that these other issues need to be addressed before that technology is going to be provided. There's also language in the appropriations bill that would address that. So I think we need to be very clear about where we stand and what's acceptable and what's not acceptable behavior.
Thank you. One final question, and then I can't wait to bring our audience into this discussion to take a few questions. I want to sort of look towards the future. So next year, NATO celebrates the 70th anniversary of its founding on April 4th, 1949. If I read the NATO Declaration correctly, I think there was intent to host not a summit, perhaps a leaders' meeting in celebration of that milestone. My question to you both, what do you see in a year ahead? What would you like to see the Senate NATO Observer Group do, and what's your measure of success? And what's your message to the American people on NATO's 70th anniversary? What does it mean to the next generation of Americans? I think we speak very fondly and very neuralgically in some ways about NATO. What does NATO mean to your children and your grandchildren? How do we send that message? So think about your messaging in the future. Senator Tillis, I'll start with you. What's the message from the Senate NATO Observer Group next year?
I tell people that sometimes being a senator, or before that being Speaker of the House, is like being on an episode of the old Star Trek, 55 minutes of drama, all of a sudden a solution, fly off to the next galaxy. I hope that that's where we are with all this discourse on NATO. I think that we need to get past the drama. We need the NATO nations to make it very clear what their plan is to get up to the 2% investment. And about 20% reserve for R&D or modernization. Let's just settle that, because really that's the only thing that may resonate with the American people. So let's get that done over the next year, saying we get it. We've gone in the wrong direction over time. We get it. Here's our plan for getting to a point to where that comes off the table. I think that hopefully it's a NATO conference where the trade discussions have abated. We've addressed some of the inequities that are legitimate, but that we all of a sudden are a military alliance and an economic alliance, and that we've healed the wounds that come from some of the rhetoric, that I think some of it may have been necessary to shock the system on getting the investment right. Some of it I think was unnecessary and unproductive, but we get past that so that we're back to a productive dialogue where we are talking about how that alliance and the synergy that comes from the family of nations who are allies and partners are now facing down Russia and China and the real threats to national and homeland security for the family of nations that make up NATO.
Thank you. Senator Shaheen?
Well, I also would hope that we would have seen the entry of Northern Macedonia by next year, that some of the other nations that are looking for entry into NATO would have made some progress towards that, and particularly in the Balkans, where we still have countries like Bosnia that are fragile democracies, and if we can get them on a path to joining NATO, it's one of the things that can help them continue to make some of the reforms that are important. I hope that we will have taken further steps to blunt Russia's aggression in Europe. You know, one of the things that got overshadowed at the NATO Summit was some of the other innovations that are happening at NATO. They're setting up a new cyber command that is going to expand the work that's been done in cyber, where we're really looking at that challenge, not just in the United States, but around the world. The cyber attacks that are coming from not just Russia, but from North Korea, from China, and addressing that is really important. And we don't have, right now, we don't have a center of excellence that's doing that. And to have NATO taking that up is really important. They've also started a new effort that's looking at the Atlantic. So us, Canada, and the importance of that transatlantic effort, and an effort to look at transport in Europe. One of the things we found as we started restationing troops in countries around Europe is that we ran into some transportation problems with getting people and equipment where they needed to go, because there have been changes in rail that have not been addressed since the end of the Cold War, when we started pulling our troops out of Europe. So some of those initiatives that are really important to the strength of NATO hopefully are going to get off the ground and are going to make progress in a way that's going to help all of us. And then again, to remind the world about the success of the NATO alliance, because it has been critical to stability in post-World War II West and in the world, and we want to see that stability continue, and NATO, I believe, is a very critical part of that.
Fantastic. I think we have time for one quick fire round of questions, and then we'll let you answer and get everyone back. Oh, I know there's too many hands. So if I can just take Donna up here, we'll take the 2 questions here, and I'll try to take 2 here. Keep them extremely short. Colleagues, if you could please introduce yourself and ask the question. Thank you. We'll take them both. Yes.
Voice of America, Natalia Robert. I have a question about Ukraine. Just the other day, Mr. Putin said in an interview with Chris Wallace that the reaction of Russian Federation, should NATO decide to let Ukraine and Georgia in, will be very negative. And my question is, will that deter United States from supporting Ukraine's aspiration into NATO?
Fantastic. Sir, did you have a question as well?
Voice of America again, but different service, Russian service. Could you please both comment on President's remarks on Montenegro? Thank you.
And we had 2 here, John, and then we'll take the Cole right here in the front. Yeah, right in the front. Thank you. John, wait, grab for the microphone. No, you're good. You're good. Right there. Thank you.
Hi, John Heffern, retired Foreign Service Officer. Senator Corker had a really brief statement after the President's performance in Helsinki that he's taxing the Americans with tariffs, pushing away allies, strengthening Putin. It's time for Congress to step up and take back our authorities. We've got legislation to do that. Let's vote. I think I know Senator Shaheen's answer to that question. Senator Tillis, would you support Corker on that effort?
Thank you. And John, right behind you, thank you so much. And that's our last question.
Hi, thanks. Rachel, also reporter with Congressional Quarterly. This question is primarily for Senator Shaheen. We don't know what will happen in the midterms, but if Northern Macedonia session comes before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, do you believe Senator Risch, who would become chair if Republicans hold, would support that in a timely manner? I noticed in the last discussion 1 or 2 weeks ago, he seemed to kind of hedge when you brought up your resolution, offering, recommitting support for NATO and including collective defense.
3 great questions, very focused on enlargement. So, Senator Tillis, please.
On Russia or on Ukraine, I don't have any interest in Russia's opinion about a cession of a potential NATO ally. On Montenegro, very similar to the conversation I gave, or the discussion I gave earlier. Montenegro is a very important ally. The smaller nations that are on the front line we need to take care of because they're willing to come to us in compliance with Article 5. On Corker's legislation, I think it is time. I have not reviewed the specifics of his legislation or specifics of his resolution. I think it would be helpful for us to have a voice so that people know that the Congress is speaking. And Jeanne had the other question.
That was extremely efficient, Senator.
Very
Thank
good.
you.
Well, you said lightning round.
Senator.
Okay, so I'll start with the question about Senator Risch, should he become chair of the Foreign Relations Committee. He voted for the resolution that passed the Foreign Relations Committee 20-1. Rand Paul was the only person who did not vote for it. I went to Georgia with Senator Risch for their elections when President Saakashvili was voted out of office in an election that was deemed free and fair, and we watched that, and I know that he's committed to making sure that the countries who are under threat from Russia are supported by the United States. So I am optimistic that he would be there. I certainly support a number of pieces of legislation that are being looked at to address and reassure our allies and post the Helsinki press conference. One of those that has already passed the Judiciary Committee would reaffirm the importance of Robert Mueller's investigation. I think that's very important to do, especially given the statements by the President during that press conference. I know there are a number of other things being looked at. Senators Rubio and I can't remember who else have legislation around cyber that would say if Russia meddles in our elections in 2018, there would be automatic new sanctions on them. I think there are a number of other things that can be done and that are being looked at, and that we should explore every avenue to make it very clear that we believe in Congress that Russia continues to meddle, that they meddled in 2016, that they're continuing to do that, and that we support our intelligence agencies despite what the President said. On Montenegro, I think it took way too long for the Senate to support the accession treaty for Montenegro, especially after we had clear evidence that Russia had tried to engineer a coup in Montenegro. Because they don't want Macedonia, Montenegro, other countries in the Balkans, which have historically been areas of Russian influence, to join the West. That's what's going on. That's why they oppose Ukraine and Georgia looking westward. And we need to make it very clear that we support those efforts, because we want those countries to be part of the Western sphere of influence. So now Georgia and Ukraine obviously have a lot of hurdles that they would have to get through in order to be asked to join NATO, but they have been working at that, and I'm hopeful they're going to continue to make progress.
I think my one concern, just to double back, Senator Tillis, something that you mentioned about Russian influence in Macedonia. We had a report last week that Greece expelled 2 Russian diplomats interfering in the Macedonia referendum. There's 2 parts to this: the referendum that has to occur, the name change within the Republic of North Macedonia, as well as Greece. To your point, Senator, about Montenegro, attempts are being made to go to extreme measures to prevent these countries moving towards NATO, towards the EU. General Scaparrotti himself, in congressional testimony earlier this year, said he is very concerned about the Western Balkans. I mean, this is the blinking red lights that we have to focus on, pay attention, clarity of message, clarity of unity, alliance unity is absolutely critical. Well, I have to say, all things work out the way they're supposed to, because I think we needed your voices after the summit, actually more than before the summit. Senator Tillis, I love that Star Trek theme. Here's my question. Who's Captain Kirk and who's Spock in this group?
I was thinking about
that?
I was thinking about being Scotty. We're over in the, we're doing the best we can. But look, I will tell you the one thing about Vladimir Putin. The way that you can tell he is being dishonest on Russian meddling, whether it's in our elections or in these other nations, is his lips are moving. Honestly. There's not an honest bone in his body with respect to the way Russia is going about hybrid warfare and meddling in elections, meddling in public policy. Period. End of story. We have data to we have intelligence to substantiate it. We have the input of our NATO allies. We have the input of other partners. And we need to recognize that this man is not an honest broker, has a lot of work to be done before they ever get elevated to a level that we would even consider a meaningful relationship with them and treat them like a nation that we should have a normalized relationship with.
And just to add to that, as we've seen, they're finding some fertile ground in Europe, in Italy, in Austria, in Hungary,
Indeed.
in places that we're beginning to see backtrack on democratic values. And so it's very important for us to be clear, as you say, Heather, in our messaging about what we support and what we think is important, and about who we help and how we do that.
Well, before I tell Scotty to beam us up, will you please join me in thanking Senator Tillis and Senator Shaheen for a great conversation? If everyone can just remain seated.